I'm Chris Wells, President and CEO of Nexus.net. We're a Platinum Magento hosting partner, and I just want to give you an anecdote before I start about Nexus and Magento. Before Magento existed, we hosted Varian's stuff. They were an agency, and we hosted a lot of their clients. And Roy came to me one day. We used to talk very often. Now he's much too busy. Came to me one day and said, "Hey man, I've got this idea. Basically, we're going to like ditch OS commerce. We're going to make this new thing and make our own shopping cart. What do you think?" And I was like, "Seriously, dude? There's like 1,000 shopping carts. Why is yours better? Oh, we've got all this. We've done all this great stuff." And honestly, I didn't buy it. I wasn't convinced by Roy and his pitch back in the nascent days, back in 06, 07, and it took us a long time to get on the Magento train. I must say, I'm glad we did. I mean, given the community, given how big it's gotten, clearly I was slow, as I often am, and I'm happy that I knew Roy at that time to be able to grow with Magento. So I'm from the Detroit area, which is not a bad thing per se. One of the neat things about Detroit is it's on the international border between Canada and the US, and you don't think about Detroit as being on the border, but it is. And one of the neat things about being on the border is obviously going to Canada, the availability of Canada, but beyond that, there's some interesting facts about being a border city that I want to share. There are 2 crossings from Detroit to Canada, Windsor, Ontario, one of which is the Windsor Tunnel under the river, the Detroit River. The other is the Ambassador Bridge. What's curious about both is that if you're traveling north on either the bridge or the tunnel, you're actually going into the US. So think about it for a moment. If you travel north, you're going to the US. If you travel south, you're going to Canada. It's the only 2 crossings in the contiguous 48 states where you go south to enter Canada. Also, regarding the bridge in particular, it was built in 1929. It's a suspension bridge, pretty standard by my standards, I guess. And it alone accounts for, let me back up for a second. It alone is the busiest trade route busiest route by trade volume between the US and Canada, the busiest single route. It alone, this bridge, carries 25% of the commerce between the 2 countries. All it is a 4-lane highway. There's nothing special about it. It's been there 85 years. It's amazing that the folks who built it back in 1929 had the foresight, and maybe it's been changed since then, but had the foresight to make it last. And commerce can still go on that bridge to this day, and a large portion of the commerce between the 2 countries. This is the Ambassador Bridge, and this is actually from the Windsor side looking back to Detroit. Today's topics, I'm going to have to go a little bit quicker than I thought I would. I think I planned for 40 minutes. I got about 30. I'm going to go through a note on permissions. I'm a big fanatic about permissions, especially on the Unix file system. I'm going to go over some LAMP stuff, and essentially the AMP portion of LAMP, not the Linux portion. PHP basics, PHP tweaks, some PHP FPM stuff, web servers, database servers, and using Varnish with Magento. So hopefully on the AMP side, I'll give you a good overview of what it takes to make Magento perform. Again, this is a 30-minute discussion. I can't go into detail, but feel free to stop me anytime you want for a question. I'm happy to answer if I can. So permissions for a second. Now, this isn't a performance thing per se, but it's simply a housekeeping thing that I'm pretty fanatical about. Permissions matter. And what I mean by permissions is the file and directory permissions on the actual Unix file system, how your files are seen by the web server, by PHP, and so on. So most people think Chmod 666, Chmod 777 equals, right? Make it work good, because that's what everybody tells you to do when you install their software. Now, I understand from the web development perspective, it's the easiest mechanism to make the software work, but it's also the least secure. So before we get started with all the meat of the discussion, let's fix the permissions. And this is going to assume you're running something like FPM or SUPHP, whereby PHP is interpreted by by a process running as the actual user, that is you. I'll also say the Magento user often in the talk, so it's one and the same. So the first thing we want to do is fix it. And this is all relative to your web root. The first thing you want to make sure you have is directories owned by you. Often they'll say, hey, make the media directory owned by Apache, the web server, or something else. Or you install it sloppily and they're owned by root or somebody else. So the first thing is to do, make sure that your user, the one that's actually going to run the code, owns the directories and the files. And that find command will do just that. Second is make sure browsing directories by others isn't trivial, meaning 711 permissions on a directory simply says that I, the user, can go into the directory. I can ls, I can make a file. But a 11 on the end means anybody else can't even ls. They can get into the directory, but they can't do a listing. So if there's anybody that happens to get past default security and gets to a point of snooping, it's much harder to snoop. So if they're trying to find your database passwords and other things, it makes it that much harder. 3 is make sure the web server can read everything, because again, the web server needs to read JPEGs, images, CSS, JavaScript. So make sure the web server can read it all. It doesn't need to know, the web server does not ls your directory, so 711 is sufficient, but make sure it can read each one with 644 permissions. Continuing, PHP scripts are for your eyes only. They should be owned by you, which we did in the first step, and also they should be readable and readable by you and only you and nobody else. So 600 on the PHP scripts, again, in a world where you're doing FPM or SUPHP. And finally, make sure your config files are secure. So 600 on your XML files for Magento is what they should be. It's a layer of security beyond the defaults. So again, this isn't the end all, but it definitely helps when folks are snooping. And this is one thing I've had to go over with our folks over and over. I put a blog post about it, and it's just something that I don't see talked about ever. So I'm trying to do it here today while we're on the subject. So on to PHP. Use APC. APC is important. You can use it for a lot of different things with Magento, and I'll talk about that later on, but use it as an opcode cache. It works wonders. It's a very, very good system. We've had issues with eAccelerator. We don't recommend it. APC is better, and I can go into detail later on if you'd like. A couple config changes here, just the default size of the cache, how many files can be in the cache. APC stat is important on production systems. Essentially, APC stat saying, should I try and detect whether a file has changed or not, and if it has changed, I should then reread it and reinterpret it. On a production system, you don't want to do that. It just incurs extra overhead. Bump the memory limit. This is a simple one. 512 has worked well for all of our clients. You may think it's too much. You can bring it down. But on a system with multiple gigs of memory, it's typically fine. Turn off Open Baster. If you're in a multi-tenant environment, this isn't desirable. Most of what I'm talking about today is a dedicated server or beyond. Open Baster kills your real path caching ability, and it makes each request take an inordinate amount of time longer than it should otherwise. Use a recent version of PHP, as recent as you can. 5.4 I know has issues, or may have issues with Magento. We've tried it and seen our own issues, but the point is use the latest one that you can with your system. Now, the PHP handoff, and this is probably one of the most important parts of the talk. The handoff from PHP is important. That is how the PHP script how the request gets from the user through the web server to PHP. And I'm going to breeze through this because of time, but please stop me if you have a question. The traditional way is Apache mod PHP. This is what is installed by default on most systems. It's been installed for a long, long time. Essentially, PHP runs as the web server user, so it would break our permissions fixes we did in step 1. It's also part of the Apache, what I call mega process. That is, Apache and PHP live in the same process space, so every time you have a new Apache, you have a new PHP. Whether it's needed or not is irrelevant because you get it. So it can scale, but it can't scale as well as other things can because of this marriage. The next typical mechanism, when we actually used to do this, is Apache plus SUPHP. We typically err on the side of security over performance, and we've gotten complained at about that, but it's the right thing to do. That said, this luckily is no longer the preferred mechanism. SUPHP allowed Apache to hand off the PHP script and have it be run as the Magento user. This is a very heavyweight solution, though, meaning it's very slow. It incurs a lot of overhead because each request has to exec a PHP. Essentially, it's got to make a new PHP and provide the PHP all the details, and then get the data back and send it out. So it runs as you, which is good, but it's very, very expensive to actually make perform. Finally, and what we prefer and use to this day is Apache or Nginx plus FPM. FPM is a method for having a pool of PHP processes available, and they can be large or small. They're configurable, much like Apache is configurable. Nginx is configurable in terms of what is waiting for a connection. It runs as you. You have your own personal PHPs, and very cheap to use. You can have processes waiting for PHP, and they just process it and are done. It scales much better too than either mod PHP or SUPHP. This breaking up of the two makes it so that each can operate more efficiently. And so just a brief overview, if you're using mod PHP, on the left-hand side here. Again, mega process. The handoff is internal to Apache. If you're using SUPHP, there's a handoff. It's more distinct, but it's very, very expensive via this exec mechanism. And ultimately, FPM, whereby you hand off, and it's a very, very quick mechanism, and you can have more FPM instances available at will. So this is, again, a preferred method with Nginx or Apache. So the web server showdown, Apache versus Nginx. We've had a lot of our clients ask, and I know it's a hot topic in the community. Actually, Fabrizio's here. I noticed he was talking about using Apache now and moving to Nginx. We've done a lot of benchmarking, and I've got some ideas, but some opinions on what's best or what isn't best. So, is it Apache or Nginx? And the answer, at least my answer, is yes. It's both, and I'll show you why in a second. Apache comes bloated. I mean, it's a big old process. It's a big old web server. It's worked well for a lot of years. That said, if you tune it, it can be very nimble. It's not as nimble as Nginx, and I'll absolutely concede that. That said, much of what happens on at least a standard web server is in PHP and not on the Apache/Nginx side. And I'll show you some graphs in a second. The other nice thing is Magento supports Apache out of the box. So if you aren't an Nginx expert, for instance, it's much easier to just get going with Apache, and it works, and Magento expects it to a degree, as do extensions, and often developers expect it. Rewrites work without much fuss. It's all just there out of the box. What's nice is FPM, again, the preferred method, levels the playing field between Nginx and Apache. Often you'll see Nginx FPM benchmarked against Apache mod PHP, and that works to a point, but then Nginx just kind of takes over. And I'll show you, again, some data here in a second. Varnish helps as well. So Varnish further buffers what's happening in front of the web servers, making the web server choice, in my opinion, less important, and it becomes more of a usability thing than a performance thing. So I say go with what you know. If you know Apache and you can make it work, it's completely valid. If you like Nginx, that's fully valid as well. So we have a white paper out yesterday, and I'm going to show you some caps from the white paper. And I won't go into details about what was behind this in terms of hardware. I will tell you that the tests were run on identical hardware, and everything was identical in terms of the hardware itself and the testing methodology. And this is Nginx versus Apache, both with FPM. Now, Nginx is faster. Here's our Nginx. The red circle is our Apache number, 546 transactions per second, which was Apache's essentially maximum. Nginx had 555. So it was negligible. Granted, Nginx was faster, but was it worth, if you're an individual user, is it worth relearning the system to use Nginx? It's up to you to decide. I would say probably not. So again, our choice is both. We prefer Apache, but I mean, again, both are valid. It comes down to what you know and what you can use. The DB showdown, Percona versus MySQL. This one's a little bit easier. Percona just wins. Yes, sir. Yes, it was a fully tweaked Apache as best as we know how to do it. And fair, I have to ask that question. I didn't do the actual test. I know. Listen, I know we had to tweak Apache because Apache is this big, massive, hog. Nginx, I can ask the guys who did the testing and see for sure. And we published it, the white paper too, and I think it has the configs as well for Nginx and for Apache, so you can see for yourself what the configs were. So back to the DB showdown here. There was really no contention. Percona just simply won by a lot. So in our previous benchmarks, what's curious is MySQL is better than Percona on reads on a very, very low level. So if you're reading a little bit of data, MySQL actually beat out Percona a little bit. But once you start doing writes and having contention, and once you start really stressing the system, you can see Percona just beats it, and it beats it once it gets past a certain threshold. The metrics here on the bottom, 35 buyers, a Gatling test going through the full checkout, a browser, simply someone looking at the site. So again, and scaling up with Percona, we were getting, it was over 18, 19 orders per second at 3,000 buyers. And again, I understand there's not a lot of data behind this. The white paper answers some of these questions, but the point is Percona was a definite winner, and there was no bones about it. Percona's benefits and tweaks. ExtraDB is good. It's fast, especially under load. It can handle the load. It's a simple replacement. You just drop it in. There's not a lot of extra stuff you have to do. It reads the same config files, so it's a very easy replacement. Some quick my.cnf tweaks, and these are dependent on system. Thread concurrency, we found no benefit going past 24. Buffer pool size I'll mention for a second. It really depends on your database size, and we've got a client running a 96 gig buffer pool because they've got a ton of stuff going on and a big database. The others can tweak as needed. It really depends on what your setup is. The last one is for mitigating some double buffering. But again, these are recommended to a point. Do some research though. These aren't a one-size-fits-all type metric. On to caching. So caching in Magento is hard. If you attended Fabrizio's talk this morning, you can see that there's multiple levels of caching going on, and it takes a lot to understand all the various caches and how they interact. We have to take essentially a common denominator to a point, so we have a best fit for what we think is going to happen for the most of our clients. We do tweak, obviously, as needed. That said, take this as a best default if you're getting started. And just real quick, there are different caching backends for Magento to use. One is Memcache. The pros are it's multi-threaded. That is, it can handle multiple requests simultaneously. It can be socket or TCP based, and we often use sockets, the Unix sockets, to talk to a Memcache for security reasons if we're on a multi-tenant environment. It can also talk over TCP, so you can have a single Memcache instance using TCP to connect to it. So nodes can share a single TCP nodes can share a single Memcache instance. A con is it has no tagging, and I'll explain tagging in a second. Redis is another backend. Redis is very fast and very good. It has tagging, and what tagging does is essentially you can segment the cache into groups, basically. And when a cache flush occurs, you can flush a given group, but not the entire cache. Cache flushes are expensive. The less you do, the better. A problem with Redis is it's single-threaded. So in our tests, in our benchmarks, we did hit the Redis limit. That said, we were pushing it probably further than was realistic. You can use Redis by itself, although we don't recommend it. That said, it's one of those things where it's probably apples, oranges kind of deal. The last is APC. The pros are, again, it provides a great opcode cache. It's absolutely awesome at opcode caching. Beyond that, though, it's tied to the PHP process, and we just found that not to be the best thing. Having this independent Redis or Memcache instance is better than having APC as a storage mechanism tied to a single process. If that process goes away, all the cache data goes away. It's just better to segment the two, in my opinion at least. So caching best practices. And this is going to be essentially what we found as a good start, or call it a good start. And you can tweak from here. First one is, if you're using Magento Enterprise, definitely turn on the full page cache. It's absolutely worth it. I'll show you some metrics in a second on how worth it is, but it's definitely worth the simplicity of installing Redis and turning it on. You get huge throughput gains, huge response time gains, which is even better. Your users get that page quicker. Use a dedicated Redis instance. Use a dedicated Redis instance just for the full page cache. Don't share it with anything else. Use that one just for the FPC. We found if you share it, you start getting performance degradation, which I can go into later. It's quick, it's easy, and it works. If you're not using Enterprise, there is no simple light switch. You can't just turn on the equivalent of a fast page cache. That said, you can use something like Varnish to definitely boost performance. The problem is Varnish comes with other baggage, which I'll, again, talk about in 1 second. So how much does it give you, the full page cache? This is simply a test of full page cache throughput versus the non-full page cache Magento. And you can see once the cache is warmed after whatever it is, 30 minutes or so, it's performing at multiple times what the non-FPC can do. It's a huge benefit. For response time, without the cache, it's like two and some odd seconds. With the cache, it's under half a second. So it's reasonable. It's not great, but it's reasonable. So our second part here is we've gotten past full page cache, have it on, have Redis if you have Enterprise installed. Beyond that, set up the 2-level cache. For the fast cache, use Memcache, and there's been some contention about this internally with us. But for now, we recommend Memcache. It's multi-threaded. If your Memcache is sized correctly, it can actually hold the bulk of the data, and the fast cache is where that makes a difference. You can also run multiple Redis instances if you like. Again, it's single-threaded, so you can do 2, 3, or 4. It becomes a management issue at that point. It's easy to do, but it's something else to have to monitor and deal with. For the slow cache, use Redis. Redis is, again, good, and Redis is working on issues with their multi-threadedness too, so it's still a fine piece of software. But again, single-threaded, and the slow cache may not even be used. So we've done tests and found that often if the fast cache has got all the data, slow cache is never even hit. Set up a dedicated Memcache for sessions. Now you can do things like persistence, and it's a good idea. We haven't got there yet with this benchmarking suite, but we may in the future. And size the caches correctly. And correctly is, again, objective. If you've got 1 million SKUs, that means one thing. If you've got 10,000, it means something else. So this is cache size of the slow, the fast, and the FPC over time. And you can see how they fill. And you'll notice that this is where you'd get your metrics on how big the caches need to be. And again, it's a contrived test, and you can get this from a real-world instance if you're doing it on your own site. But this is how you can tell what each cache should be relative size-wise. And again, this is contrived in that it's a certain benchmark. This doesn't mean you should go back and change your cache settings to be these. Now, this one's interesting. This is over time, the full page cache utilization in terms of hit percentage. You can see the green line on the bottom, and essentially which is the slow cache, it starts out getting some hits, but after about 5-10 minutes, it becomes not useless, but it's not being used, put it that way. The FPC and the fast cache are both being used, with each taking an hour and a half or so to actually fully warm. So, on to Varnish. And for a hosting company, Varnish is awesome because it provides great performance, but it's also terrible because it's not simple. And Fabrizio's talk too, he talked about Varnish being not just a simple drop-in, and we could not agree more. Varnish can help, but it takes a lot of management, it takes a lot of tweaking, and it adds layers of complexity that often is hard to provide or hard to fix from a hosting company standpoint. So one does not simply turn on Varnish. We often get clients just turn on Varnish. You just can't turn on Varnish, unfortunately. There are other issues too. We've actually created a plugin for Magento called Turpentine, which is open source and free for enterprise and for community, which bridges the gap between Varnish and Magento for cache clearing and other things. So feel free to check it out. It's free software, and it helps with just turning on Varnish. But still, it's not even with it or any other plugin for that matter. It doesn't make it a simple turn-on operation. So caching the caches with Varnish. It caches entire pages. Essentially, Varnish sits in front of all the optimization we've already talked about, except for we've turned the full page cache off for a variety of reasons, but it sits in front of all the caching, all the web server choices, all the database choices, and caches everything, full pages or parts of pages. So it's nice because, again, for static content, for non-dynamic content, it works great. It can take that page from memory and just spit it out in a matter of less than a second. So again, use an extension to integrate. Turpentine is ours. It's free and open source for all users. You can get huge performance gains for visitors using Varnish. It's ridiculous, to tell you the truth. It requires more thought though than the FPC, the full page cache. Again, the full page cache is easy. You turn it on, it works. Varnish is something you have to think about and actually plan for and have strategies for dealing with. SSL requires further hoop jumping. Again, it's not a huge problem, but it's yet more complexity as you add these things in. There's also ESI, which is edge side includes, which is where you can take bits of a page or chunks and cache those in Varnish as well. Again, doable. Turpentine can do it, but it's not something you just turn on and works. It requires template changes, possibly other code changes that a hosting company has a hard time doing, and we don't typically like to do. So what can you do with Varnish? So this is the full page cache versus Varnish at 250 user concurrency, pushing almost 4,000 transactions per second versus it was 550. As we add concurrency, the full page cache performance goes down, Varnish's goes up because it can handle the actual throughput. So it can do amazing things on static content, almost 7,000 transactions per second. This is a curious graph. This is the full page cache versus Varnish over time, and you'll notice the scale is logarithmic. So whereas the blue line peaks at about 550, the orange line is almost 10,000. And the reason the orange line looks, yes, sir? No, community. And the Turpentine extension works with both. A lot of other extensions do too. Varnish can be put in front of anything. The orange line is jaggy because our test rig was pushing a gigabit at the benchmarking server, and there was network issues. There wasn't server issues. So we had this jaggy graph, and we're like, what's going on here? And it wasn't because of Magento performance. It was because of the actual network latency and other networking issues between the test rig and the test cluster. But again, it was like 10,000 something per second. Also response time. So beyond the benefits you get from full page cache for response time, which was about less than half a second, Varnish it's not 0, but it's sure a lot closer to 0 than the FPC was. So some final thoughts. 777 and 666 are evil. Please don't do them. If you do them, you're doing it wrong, honestly. No one talks about this, and it's true. PHP FPM is the way to go. Nginx, it doesn't matter. Apache doesn't matter. They can be friends. But FPM, I can't stress enough. Percona, definitely. No reason not to use Percona. FPC with Redis backend for the full page cache, if you're going to do it that way. 2-level caching, fast cache, Memcache, slow cache, Redis. Turpentine, Varnish if you can, but again, one does not simply turn on Varnish. I'm going to plug real quick our white paper in Turpentine. Turpentine's available at nexusnet/turpentine. Again, it's free, open source for enterprise and community. And I believe it's with the more recent versions of each. And the white paper is available as well. And it's roughly 30 pages of more of the graphs that I showed you and the methodology behind it, what we found. Feel free to read it. Tear it apart, tell us we're wrong. I'm happy to adjust. And we're going to do, I think, 2 of these a year. And just for the community's sake, so we can all see what works and what doesn't. It doesn't benefit us beyond, the practice benefits us, obviously. We found out a lot that we didn't know, but hopefully it benefits you whether you're with us or not. So, questions, and thank you for coming. Thanks.